The year is 1976. The muscle car era is already bleeding out on the pavement. Gas prices are high. Insurance companies are ruthless. Emissions regulations are tightening by the month. And inside GM, engineers are being told one thing over and over again: survive. That's when Chevrolet quietly gives birth to an engine that, on paper, should have saved the small block V8. The 305, a 5-liter V8 meant to balance power, fuel economy, and emissions. Meant to keep the V8 alive when everything else was being strangled. It was a compromise forged in the fires of crisis, a product of pure corporate necessity. It had to be small enough to appease the regulators, but still sound and feel like a Chevrolet V8 to the customer holding on to a fading dream of American performance. But what almost nobody realizes is this: the 305 was doomed the moment the first block was cast. And the reason why isn't marketing. It isn't bad timing. It's geometry. Most people think they know this engine. They remember it as the weak one, the disappointing one, the engine their Camaro or Monte Carlo got stuck with. But not like this. Not from the inside, where the numbers tell a story of fundamental limitation. The story of the Chevy 305 doesn't start with failure. It starts with fear. By the mid-1970s, Chevrolet's legendary small block family was under siege. The 350 had dominated American roads and racetracks for 2 decades. With a 4.0-inch bore and a 3.48-inch stroke, it was simple, flexible, and brutally effective. It was an icon. But the world had changed, and icons were being legislated out of existence. New emissions laws demanded cleaner, more complete combustion, a process strangled by low-lead or unleaded fuel and exhaust gas recirculation. Fuel economy standards known as CAFE punished displacement with a heavy hand, and compression ratios that once sat comfortably at 10.51, yielding crisp throttle response and power, were now being slashed to the mid-8s just to survive on the new detonating fuel. The very soul of the V8 was being chemically and legally neutered. GM needed a smaller V8. Something that looked efficient on paper, but still sounded like America. They couldn't walk away from 8 cylinders. The market expectation was too strong. So, they looked at their iconic 350 and made a decision. They would keep the architecture, the parts commonality, the tooling. But they would shrink it, so they shrank the bore. Not a little, a lot. The 305 was built with a 3.736-inch bore and the same 3.48-inch stroke as the 350. Do the math and you get 305 cubic inches, exactly what the badge said. On the surface, it seemed logical. Same stroke, smaller bore. A shorter piston travel distance, theoretically less friction. It should be more efficient. But that bore size changed everything. It was the seed of an inescapable curse. Inside the engine, the valves were now fighting for space. The cylinder walls sat perilously close to the intake and exhaust valves, a condition called valve shrouding. This shrouding choked airflow, creating turbulence right at the point where a smooth, laminar flow is most critical. The engine's potential breath was stifled by its own architecture. Even before the engine ever fired, its lungs were restricted. The combustion chamber became a cramped, inefficient space. This was the silent geometric betrayal. The 305 was born with asthma, and that's the moment it was already in trouble. When the first 305s hit the road in cars like the Monte Carlo and Nova, they weren't monsters. They weren't even exciting. They were apologetic. Early versions, strangled by single exhaust systems, dismal compression, and lazy camshafts, made around 130 to 145 horsepower. Torque hovered in the low 240 lb-ft range. This wasn't muscle. It was survival mode, a faint whisper of what a V8 used to be. You could hear it in the way the engine revved, a flat, breathless sound that gave up early. You could feel it in the way it ran out of steam, a sensation that the power was always just out of reach, trapped behind a wall the throttle pedal could never breach. Chevy tried to sell it as efficient power. But enthusiasts, especially those who had experienced the previous decade, knew better. Compared to a 350, even a low-compression, smog-strangled 350, The 305 felt like it was constantly holding back, a dog on a very short leash. And the worst part? There was almost nothing you could do about it. You could bolt on a 4-barrel carburetor, but it was like giving a deeper breath to someone with a collapsed lung. The underlying structure couldn't support it. You could advance the timing until it pinged, but the gains were marginal. The limitation was cast in iron. Here's where the real nightmare begins for anyone who wanted more. In a V8, airflow is everything. Power doesn't come from displacement alone. It comes from how efficiently air and fuel can enter the cylinder, mix, burn completely, and exit. The 305's small bore physically limited valve size. There was simply no room for larger valves without intersecting the cylinder wall. Even with so-called performance heads, the valves simply couldn't open into enough clean space. They opened into a wall. At higher RPM, where an engine needs to breathe most freely, the incoming air charge would slam into the cylinder wall next to the intake valve instead of flowing cleanly into the chamber. Volumetric efficiency, the measure of how completely an engine fills its cylinders, plummeted. Power fell off hard, like running into a soft, invisible barrier. The engine would sign off early, refusing to rev with any enthusiasm. Mechanics and grassroots racers noticed it immediately. One GM technician reportedly said, "You could cam it, carb it, and header it, and it still felt like it was breathing through a straw." And he wasn't wrong. A performance camshaft that would lope beautifully in a 350 would often just kill the bottom-end torque in a 305 without adding meaningful top-end, because the head couldn't support the flow. Headers helped scavenge exhaust, but they couldn't fix the intake bottleneck. A typical 305 head used 1.84-inch intake valves. Some later performance variants, like the HO or L69 heads, stretched to 1.94 inches, but even that was pushing the limit. Machining the seats for those larger valves often left the valve seat perilously close to the water jacket, risking leaks and overheating. Compare that to a 350, which could comfortably run 2.02-inch or even 2.05-inch valves with room to spare. That difference of 1/10 of an inch or more doesn't sound huge. But in the high-stakes physics of engine breathing, where fractions of an inch dictate the behavior of thousands of cubic feet of air, it's everything. It was the difference between a hallway and a crawl space. Chevy tried to fight back. They had to. The badge-engineered performance of the late 70s and early 80s demanded it. In the early 1980s, they rolled out the 305 high output. This version got better heads with those 1.94-inch valves, higher compression, creeping up to around 9.5.1 in some years, a more aggressive camshaft, and a dual snorkel air cleaner. In cars like the Camaro Z28 and Monte Carlo SS, horsepower climbed to about 190, and later, with the magic of tuned port injection, around 215 to 230 horsepower. On paper, it looked respectable. It sounded good. The cars looked the part with their bulging hoods and bold decals. On the street, it still couldn't escape its genetic limits. You could rev a 305 HO harder, and it would make more power than its anemic predecessor, but the power curve told the truth. Peak torque came early, around 3,000 to 3,500 RPM, then flattened and fell. Past about 5,000 RPM, it felt like someone had closed a door. The TPI system, with its long runners tuned for low-end torque, was actually a perfect match for the 305's characteristics. It accentuated its one relative strength, but it also hid its fatal weakness. It made the engine feel punchy around town, but ask for a sustained top-end pull, and the emptiness returned. And then there was the comparison no one could ignore. The ghost in every machine that wore a 305 badge. The 350 was still right there. In many GM dealerships, you could still order one. With its larger 4.00-inch bore, the 350 breathed easier. It made more torque everywhere, from idle to redline. It responded exponentially better to the same mods, and it didn't cost much more to build. So why choose the 305? For a performance car, it made no sense. The answer is emissions and politics. and corporate averaging. The smaller displacement helped GM meet increasingly stringent fleet fuel economy standards. A 305-powered Caprice, or Impala, yielded a slightly better MPG number than a 350 version, and across hundreds of thousands of units that moved the corporate average needle. It also, on a test cycle, produced fewer raw emissions simply because it burned less air and fuel per revolution. That cold, mathematical reality mattered infinitely more to regulators and corporate bean counters than how it felt to drive on an on-ramp. The 305 was a spreadsheet engine, and it performed brilliantly in the spreadsheet. But there was another, more insidious problem hiding inside the block, one that would cement its reputation among builders: overboring. Most performance engines leave room for growth. The 350, with its generous bore spacing, could safely and commonly be bored 0.030 or even 0.040 inches over without sweating. That allowed for multiple rebuilds over an engine's lifetime, for cleaning up cylinder wear, for fitting larger pistons for a few extra cubic inches. It was a platform for longevity and hot rodding. The 305? Not so much. Its thin cylinder walls, a direct consequence of squeezing that bore into a block designed for more, meant most blocks were only safe for a 0.030-inch overbore at most. Some casting variations weren't even happy with that. Go too far, and the walls would crack, distort under heat, or lose their seal. The safe zone was terrifyingly small. Engine builders and machine shops hated that. It meant fewer rebuilds before a block was scrapped. It meant fewer performance options. It meant a customer spending good money on a rebuild was always one slip of the boring bar away from catastrophe. This reputation for fragility stuck, even when the engine itself, in stock form, wasn't inherently weak. It was just unforgiving. And then came the street racing era of the 1980s, the dawn of the 5.0 wars. Fox body Mustangs were everywhere, running 5.0-liter V8s that, while also smog-equipped, had a more favorable bore-to-stroke ratio and better factory heads. They made real, usable power. Almost overnight, a cultural narrative formed. The Chevy guys in their third-generation Camaros and Firebirds found themselves outgunned by the factory Ford. The response was not to build the 305. The response was to swap it. Enthusiasts, backyard mechanics, and speed shops started yanking 305s and dropping in 350s with such routine frequency it became a cliché. The message was clear and brutal. The 305 wasn't a destination. It was an obstacle. Something you removed, something you replaced. One mechanic from the era put it bluntly: the best mod you could do to a 305 was pull it out, sell it for scrap, and drop in a 350. That perception became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The aftermarket largely ignored it. Performance parts catalogs were filled with 350 components, with the 305 often an afterthought footnote. It was an engine abandoned by the very culture it was meant to sustain. Even when fuel injection arrived in full force, the damage was done. Tuned port injection helped low-end torque and drivability immensely, but it didn't change the airflow physics. It didn't move the cylinder walls. The small bore still choked the engine at higher RPM. The architecture was the ceiling, and no amount of electronic wizardry could raise it. By the late 1980s, the performance gulf was quantifiable. A well-running TPI 305 Camaro might run the quarter-mile in the mid-15-second range. A comparable TPI 350 in a car like the Corvette or a rare IROC Z would dip into the low 14s or even high 13s with ease. That second and a half was a chasm on the street. It was the difference between relevance and ridicule. And racers noticed. So did Chevy. By the early 1990s, the writing was on the wall. The 305, in its various forms, was quietly phased out of performance applications and then from production entirely. The 350 survived longer, evolving into the LT1. Eventually, even that legendary small block gave way to the clean sheet LS era, where bore spacing, head design, and airflow were completely reimagined without the baggage of the 1970s. The LS engine's brilliance only served to highlight the 305's fundamental constraints by showing what was possible when engineers were unleashed rather than constrained. The 305 never got a second chance, never had a revival. No legendary race wins cemented its legacy. No halo car was ever built around it. It had no redemption arc. It lived its entire life in the shadow of an older brother that was better in almost every measurable way, and it died as it lived, a compromise. But here's the twist most people miss, the quiet truth that exists outside the realm of enthusiasts and drag strips. The 305 wasn't a bad engine. In the context of its true design goal, it was arguably a success. It was reliable, smooth, comparatively fuel-efficient for a V8 of its time. Many of them, ignored and unmodded, ran well past 200,000 miles with nothing more than basic maintenance. They propelled millions of Caprices, Impalas, El Caminos, and trucks without complaint. For daily driving, for towing a light trailer, for being the appliance that most cars had become, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It provided V8 smoothness and acceptable torque without drawing the ire of the EPA or bankrupting the driver at the pump. The problem is, that design goal was survival, not greatness. It was built in an era where performance was the enemy, where horsepower was a dirty word whispered in dark corners of the engineering department, where engineers weren't chasing dyno numbers, but regulatory compliance slips. And in that bleak world, the 305 made perfect sense. It was a tactical retreat, a holding action fought with slide rules and emission calibrations. Just not to enthusiasts, and that's why its reputation never recovered. An engine's legend is written by those who push it, who modify it, who race it. The 305 offered them nothing but frustration and a clear path to a different engine. It inspired no loyalty, only replacement. And that's why its story matters. It's not a story of engineering failure, but of historical capture. Because it shows how quickly an icon can be compromised by forces outside the engine bay, how political pressures and economic shocks can dictate geometry, how a single, seemingly logical design choice, shrinking the bore to save the family, can quietly, irrevocably define an engine's entire legacy. The 305 is a fossil of the malaise era, perfectly preserved in iron and aluminum. It is the engine of lowered expectations. The Chevy 305 didn't fail because it was poorly engineered. It was engineered precisely to the grim specifications of its time. It failed because it was engineered for the wrong war, a war of attrition against regulators and physics, not a war of supremacy on the streets. And once that war was over and the culture began to value power again, it had nowhere left to go. It was a soldier built for a conflict everyone wanted to forget, left behind when the peace and the horsepower finally returned.